his soldiers that the independence of the Soviet Union is in their hands.
Don't be scared.
He says that the safety of the Soviet people, their houses, factories...
Oh, nice. That would have been very useful.
...is their responsibility. If they're called on to use their weapons, they must use them well.
What's that?
Have you seen my cigarettes?
No.
Within 5 weeks, Hitler will issue his Directive Number 21. Operation Barbarossa is planned to invade the Soviet Union. As the spring of 1941 took over from the cold of the Russian winter, life for ordinary Soviet citizens went on much as it had for hundreds of years, ruled by the rhythm of seasonal changes, far from considerations of war and turmoil. As the weather warmed, there was no inkling of the fact that a few hundred miles to the west, Germany was beginning to make moves towards invasion. Since December 1940, the Luftwaffe had been flying over Soviet territory on daily reconnaissance missions, but when Stalin was told, he ordered the Red Air Force to ignore them. By the spring of 1941, the sound of German aircraft in the skies above Russian territory went almost unnoticed. The German forces distributed a Russian language manual featuring phrases like hands up and surrender. Stalin ordered it to be ignored. Swarms of aircraft flew over Red Square on May Day, the 1st of May, 1941.
The fucking Soviet
they looked impressive, especially to ordinary citizens. But Soviet military planners watching on that day knew well that most of the planes in the skies over the Kremlin were all but obsolete.
Man, I really need to work on my Fog-o-Wolf tree.
In spite of the thrill they provided for the onlookers, they were no match for the superb equipment of the German Luftwaffe, which was already massing on the western borders of the Soviet Union. Early in June 1941, Soviet authorities received reports from Switzerland and Japan that Hitler was planning to invade Russia on June the 22nd. The information gave a precise account of the German battle order and its objectives. Soviet experts considered it too detailed to be true. On June the 18th, a German soldier deserted. He expected punishment for striking an officer. He not only confirmed the date of the invasion, but gave the hour it was due to begin, 3:55 a.m. Stalin said the information could not be trusted.
Stalin was an asshole.
At 3:15 on the morning of June the 22nd, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. Many Russian air crews were on weekend leave and others were asleep. Within hours, Hitler appeared to have achieved his aim of putting the Soviet Air Force out of commission. Russian forces were confused. There was no immediate counteroffensive. Not until 4 hours after the attack was launched did Stalin order the Red Air Force to retaliate and destroy the enemy with powerful blows. Hitler could not believe the extent of his success. Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring even ordered a recount of the Soviet planes destroyed. There were more than 2,500. In the first month of Operation Barbarossa, the Luftwaffe claimed to destroy 7,500 Soviet aircraft, while losing only 770 of its own. But statistics can mislead. The Red Air Force had indeed lost almost 70% of its numbers, but the Luftwaffe's apparently smaller losses wiped out a devastating 60% of the planes available on the Eastern Front. In Washington, D.C., at the Soviet Embassy, Ambassador Umansky made a comment that must have seemed highly optimistic at the time.
Hitler has miscalculated. Ours is a nation of a moral and political unity and strength unknown in the past. It is firmly organized, devoted to its leaders, and has utmost confidence in its armed forces, which are ready for any test. Hitler's attack against my country.
This thing's cannons are retarded. I think it's like... It's like 4 20 mils and 1 30 mil.
In Moscow, the population waited, hearing daily news of the German progress. And then, in mid-July, when the way to Moscow stood open to the German army, Hitler made a decision that was to provide a reprieve for Stalin. And
that was kind of inefficient on my part, because I probably could have just let him burn.
Army and postponed his advance on Moscow till the end of September. There were 3 bombing raids on Moscow in late July, but no great damage was inflicted. As Moscow prepared for attack, the Russian summer wore on into autumn and the weather cooled. Every passing day turned the situation a little more in favor of the Soviet capital. Reinforcements arrived in Moscow from Siberia and the Far East. In Russia, there is a period of heavy rain called Rasputitsa.
I don't even know if these were even seen. I think they didn't even ever see like operational
their
usage.
sandbags and dug their defenses, it approached, apparently unconsidered by the German commander.
It handles really funky.
From the outskirts of the city to Red Square in the center, Moscow was placed on the defensive. People from surrounding areas streamed into the refuge of their capital. On September 30th, as planned, Hitler launched Operation Typhoon, his advance on Moscow. By now, there were 600 fighter aircraft ready to defend the city, half of them the new Yaks, MiGs, and Lags. On October the 7th, the Rasputitsa struck. It rained, and by the afternoon, much of Hitler's forces were bogged down. Soviet aircraft could take off from their paved airstrips at will, but the Luftwaffe pilots found themselves stuck on muddy fields.
Jesus.
The pilots defending the Moscow area were among the best in the Soviet Air Force. Some were test pilots from the design bureaus drafted into service. Luftwaffe fighter tactics in the early weeks of Barbarossa demonstrated that Soviet tactics were outmoded, and the Red Air Force pilots worked hard to develop new theories of aerial combat. What the Soviet pilots lacked in skill and tactical knowledge was to some extent compensated for by their fighting spirit and patriotic zeal. After the battle for Moscow, Guards Air regiments would be created, in which pilots took an oath, saying, "I swear to you, my country, and to you, my native Moscow, that I will fight relentlessly and destroy the fascists." With Moscow under threat of invasion, children were moved out, and so were armament and aircraft factories. Factories were dismantled, transported behind the distant Ural Mountains, and rebuilt so that production of war materials could be resumed in safety. It was a project of immense size and hardship, most of it taking place in late autumn and winter. Alexander Yakovlev left Moscow for Novosibirsk in style. He drove a Pontiac, which he had to abandon for a train, and then a plane. When he reached the site of his new factory, he found problems with missing parts, and unfinished aircraft were buried under feet of snow. But with drive and improvisation, work continued, and 3 weeks after Yakovlev arrived, the first operational Yak-1 was rolled out. Those who arrived at the new factories had to cope with shortages of food, tools, and materials. But somehow, a year after the massive move, the factories behind the Ural Mountains were producing new military aircraft at the rate of 2,000 a month. Evolution of the fighters was rapid. Weight and drag were reduced in the Yak-1M. The Yak-3 was another step forward in performance. When the Yak-3 entered service in July 1943, it was superior to both
spicy
the FW-190 and the Messerschmitt Bf-109G at altitudes below 16,000 feet. In spite of the incredible achievement of moving the factories out and making them productive, Stalin was not satisfied. When the counteroffensive from Moscow began in late 1941,
are you gonna go masturbate?
He saw a need for greater range for Soviet fighters and pressured the design bureaus to give it to him. That pressure passed down the line to the factories already working under impossible conditions.
Just take a bath then.
Many aircraft were delivered unfit to fly in combat, and overtaxed ground crews were forced to do work that should, under normal circumstances, have been completed in the factories. Nevertheless, the new Yak fighters performed well. Pilots learned on the job and in master classes conducted by new fighter aces. One of their first tasks was to overcome a deeply ingrained fear of the Luftwaffe. Then they had to learn to fight on the dive and on the climb. They had to learn to use sun and cloud cover. They had to become more aggressive and determined so that they could use the great potential of their new thoroughbred high-performance machine. Growing aggression and skill among fighter pilots had to be tempered with prudence. By the summer of 1942, the number of new fighters available was still small. It was important to keep as many planes as possible flying while numerical strength built up. This is a Yak-3. In the original Yak-1, the pilot's canopy was not raised. The rear of the fuselage ran straight back from the top of the cockpit, and pilot visibility was poor. The first major modification to the design was to cut down the rear fuselage and install a canopy with all-round vision. A two-seat trainer version, designated Yak-7V, performed so well that it was converted and fitted out as a night fighter with the designation Yak-7A. It's confusing that the Yak-7 appeared before the Yak-3 and the Yak-7V appeared before the Yak-7A, but that's the way it happened. The Yak-3 had a more powerful Klimov engine and a constant speed propeller. It was very maneuverable and considered to be an extremely formidable close combat fighter. The key to the success of Yaks was strength and simplicity. The Klimov engine was easy to maintain even under harsh field conditions. Cockpit instrumentation was simple. One Red Air Force colonel pointed out that there was no need to distract the pilot with a lot of fancy gadgets. From 1941 to 1945, more than 37,000 aircraft belonging to this family of fighters were produced. It was the most successful all-round Russian fighter of the Great Patriotic War. Artyom Mikoyan and Mikhail Gurievich's MiG design bureau was not as successful as Yakovlev in designing a fighter to meet the needs of aerial warfare over Russia and the Ukraine. The MiG-1 and MiG-3 were designed to perform well at high altitudes. They did, but unfortunately the realities of the Great Patriotic War called for lower altitude performance, and here the MiGs with their light airframe and large engine experienced handling difficulties. Also, they used the same engine as the Ilyushin Shturmovik, which was considered more important for the war effort and given priority. In the battle for Moscow, MiG-1s were available in greater numbers than the other new fighters, and they performed with distinction alongside the few Yaks and Lags available at the time. Later, they served with tactical reconnaissance squadrons, making better use of their speed and high-altitude capability. But one of Russia's greatest fighter pilots, Alexander Pakryshkin, loved the MiG-3. He used its high-altitude capability to develop a new approach to fighter tactics, closing the gap between the skills of Soviet pilots and those of the Luftwaffe.
This fucking stupid shit.
The MiG-3 was a major factor in developing his technique. He said, "I decided the thing was to fight more boldly in a vertical plane." He would spot enemy formations from high altitude and dive down, attacking where they were weakest. Other Soviet pilots saw his results and followed his lead. Severe losses as the war dragged on forced radical changes in organization of the Air Force. In May 1942, General Alexander Novikov issued an edict. In the interest of increasing striking force, it is ordered to combine the air forces of the Western Front into a unified air army. The air armies were designed to be flexible enough to respond rapidly to changes in the strategic situation. While each was assigned to support its ground army front, control and responsibility was placed in the hands of the air army commander. Losses of experienced pilots had been high, and new pilots were often briefly and inadequately trained. New controls were introduced. No pilot could break off from a dogfight without orders or abandon bomber escort duty. Forward observation stations were established on the ground just behind the front lines to provide radio guidance to fighter aircraft. Often, especially in cloudy conditions, these stations could track an enemy aircraft as it took refuge in cloud cover and relay an account of its movements to the pursuing Soviet pilot. An air army could be made up of divisions of fighter, ground attack aircraft and bombers. Bomber and Sturmovik divisions often had their own fighter regiments for escort and reconnaissance. As a result of the heavy losses of 1941 and 42, the size of fighter units was reduced. The new fighter regiments had 30 aircraft each, divided into 3 squadrons of 10. The 10 squadron members were subdivided into a pair made up of the leader and his number 2, and 2 flights of 4 aircraft each. Regimental commanders and squadron leaders flew with their units and were expected to observe and monitor their new pilots. Even in 1943, confidence was a problem for the inexperienced Russians. The reputation of the Luftwaffe was daunting for young men just out of a training program that was often inadequate. Their tendency to scatter under pressure made them easy targets for the experienced Germans, and in spite of reorganization and education, it remained a problem throughout the war. As the war continued into 1944, the Soviet fighter regiments gained a dominance over the Luftwaffe. It was largely numerical, brought about by the miracle of increasing production in the factories behind the Ural Mountains and mounting losses of Luftwaffe fighters that could not be replaced by German industry. In 1942, a new Russian fighter emerged to challenge the eminence of the Yaks. It was the Lavochkin LA-5, a direct descendant of the Lag-3, the guaranteed varnished coffin. The LA-5 was no guaranteed coffin. It was still largely wooden, but a new radial engine and some design modifications transformed it into an aircraft able to outperform new Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters at altitudes below 12,000 feet. In 1943, the LA-7 emerged. It was a redesigned and improved version of the LA-5 FN and proved itself to be the most advanced Soviet fighter in the Great Patriotic War. Stalin was so impressed with its performance that he awarded Semyon Lavochkin a special prize of 100,000 rubles. The LA-7 had a radial engine that produced 1,800 horsepower, giving the aircraft a top speed of almost 420 miles an hour. There had been problems in development. In 1942, there were two incidents where the wings of LA-5s broke in flight. At first, there were rumors of sabotage, but eventually the problem was found to be worn drill bits. They drilled holes in the wing attachments too small to take the bolts. Assembly workers were using hefty hammer blows to force them in. The structure was weakened and it failed under stress. The LA-7 was armed with two 23mm cannon located in the upper cowling. Hard points under the wings allowed armament loads of 330 pounds of bombs or 6 rockets. This is the aircraft flown by the top Russian ace of the Great Patriotic War, Ivan Kozhedub. His career began in March 1943 in an LA-5, and he moved to the LA-7 in July 1944. He flew 520 sorties and had a total of 62 kills, including 22 Focke-Wulfs and 19 Messerschmitts. By the end of the Great Patriotic War, over 200 Soviet pilots had each destroyed more than 20 German aircraft. Kozhedub and the second-ranking Russian ace, Alexander Petrushkin, were each awarded the Gold Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union 3 times. Kozhedub's record is remarkable because, as a brilliant instructor, he was held back from combat for a year and a half. At one point, he had 11 victories in 10 days. More than 10,000 Lavochkin LA-5 FNs emerged from fighter plant number 21 at Gorky, east of Moscow. From 1944 onwards, reconstituted factories at Yaroslavl and Moscow turned out more than 5,000 LA-7s. The immense quantities of munitions to arm and support them poured from factories scattered out of reach of German bombers. But the Great Patriotic War was not fought without some external assistance. This is an American Bell P-63 King Cobra, delivered to Russia late in the war under the Lend-Lease program. Lend-Lease began in October 1941. The principal fighter aircraft supplied to the Russians was the Bell P-39 Era Cobra. 4,700 were delivered to the Soviet Union via Alaska and Siberia in the course of the war. The Era Cobra was not popular with American pilots because of its poor high-altitude performance, but the Soviet pilots found that it performed well as a low-altitude fighter. Its 37mm cannon made it an effective ground attack aircraft, and it had excellent radio communication. Russian authorities have tended to downplay the effect of Lend-Lease as a factor in Soviet victory, but among fighter aircraft, and especially early in the war, it was important. In 1943, after more than 2 years of desperate struggle under conditions of extreme hardship, the Soviet Union took the upper hand in the Great Patriotic War. The influence of fighter aircraft in the eventual Soviet victory has to be seen in the context of the overall military effort. Fighters supported bombers and Sturmovik raids in the air and infantry and artillery efforts on the ground. They took part in dogfights, and they helped enforce blockades of areas under German control. The fact that Russian fighter aircraft in such a sorry state of obsolescence in 1939 could evolve so quickly and become so competitive with their superb German opponents by the middle years of the war is one of the extraordinary aspects of the Soviet military recovery. This is the Yakovlev Yak-9, the final point of evolution of the Yak fighters during the Great Patriotic War. It was a development of the Yak-7 and responded to Stalin's demands to his fighter designers for longer range. To achieve this, Yakovlev sacrificed the wooden construction of the wings. Instead of wood, the wing spars were made of lightweight metal, and this allowed larger fuel cells to be installed within the wing structure. Cannon fired through the propeller shaft, and the aircraft also carried either one or two machine guns. The Yak-9 was ready in time to take part in the Battle of Stalingrad, where fighting alongside the new Lavochkin LA-5, it became a major new factor in the aerial war. All Russian fighter aircraft used wood in some part of their construction until 1944, when the Yak-9U with an all-metal airframe was introduced. It was to remain the only Soviet fighter aircraft of the war with no wooden components. Of the 37,000 Yakovlev fighters built during the Great Patriotic War, 17,000 were Yak-9s. There were many variants, including fighter-bomber, long-range fighter, night interceptor, reconnaissance, and trainer versions. Each one maintained the simplicity and robust strength that had made the Yak-1 a success from the time it first flew. The Yak-9 was a perfect culmination of Stalin's preference for simplicity and quantity over technological refinement. The Yak-9 was not necessarily the fastest of the Yaks. Its greater fuel load was gained at the loss of some outright performance. The Yak-1M and the Yak-3, with their lighter construction, were considered to be the high-performance air superiority aircraft. The Yak-7 and Yak-9 were battlefield fighters. These two lines of evolution gave the Yaks greater flexibility of operation than any other Soviet fighters. Alexander Yakovlev was honored by Stalin at the end of the war for his contribution to the war effort. So were the other major design bureau heads, not all of whom admired Yakovlev. Some felt that he used his position as deputy head of the aircraft industry and access to Stalin's ear to promote his own interests. It seems likely that he had a hand in ensuring the end of Nikolai Polikarpov's career and the close of his design bureau after his death. But at least he had the skill to survive in the atmosphere of paranoia and terror cultivated by Stalin, and under adverse conditions produce one of the most effective fighter aircraft of World War II. This is another Yakovlev single-seater aircraft. It is a Yak-55, a distant descendant of the Yak fighters of World War II. It's one of the finest aerobatic aircraft in the world, performing maneuvers that would have been unthinkable for any World War II fighter.
Дорогие друзья, в настоящее время вы видите на аэродроме выполнять героические наказы
Russian pilots have a passion for aerobatics, developing and building on the skills established by their parents and grandparents in the fighter aircraft of the Great Patriotic War. The best of the Russian aerobatic pilots have a great international reputation, and many of them, including the one flying this plane, are women. The name of Yakovlev is no longer prominent as a designer of air superiority fighters, but the little Yak-55 recalls days of glory when Yak-1s, 7s and 9s flew to victory in the Great Patriotic War.
Up to him being 50 years old before having a first child. So more recently, in a Fast Company interview that was actually published on YouTube the June 8th, so I don't know exactly when the interview was filmed, but it was published on the day of the suicide of Anthony Bourdain. He says, and this is a question on the subject of what to do when someone is in a dark place and facing failure. He says, my answer to that question stems from my history as an addict. A lot of other addicts looked into the mirror every day and did not see somebody worth saving. Even at my worst, there was a level of vanity, I guess. I looked in the mirror and I saw somebody who, deep in there, regardless of how low I was in the circumstances, I had a high enough opinion of myself that I thought it's worth going forward. I think a lot of people in a similar situation, for some reason, look in the mirror and see somebody bad. They don't really believe in their basic worth. I did. That's vanity. So here, literally, Anthony Bourdain, in this quote and in the previous quote that I read, we have Anthony Bourdain literally describing what would be the conditions under which he would commit suicide, because he's been thinking about it before. And what he's telling us is what kept him alive up to now was the fact that he had an idea of self-respect, of self-worth, that was high enough to combat his desire to die. So what he's telling us is that if he was in a situation eventually, and this is what happened 2 days ago, if he was in a situation eventually where his view of himself and his success and his potential for the future would not be as great, that he could commit suicide. So that's very important insight into how his mind treats the question of suicide. In his view, everything's about the future, and everything's about, well, do I have something good to bring? And so 2 days ago, most likely when he committed suicide, it's because he had the impression that going forward there was nothing good that he could bring to the world. Now, another quote about failure, which was revealed in that recent interview also. He says, I accepted failure as a chef because I was at various times a bad chef, even a bad person. These days, if I fail, it's because I tried to do something and did not succeed, or I was just not able to do what I hoped to do or wanted to do. Or maybe I tried to do something that just clearly in retrospect didn't work. But I'd much rather fail gloriously than not venture, not try. No, I did not fire Lauren. She has still issues with her connection, so we will see if she's back. She says that she's trying to reconnect. Some people are suggesting that he might be the victim of a DDoS attack. So let's hope that she comes back. But worst case scenario, we'll have her later. Alright, so this gives us insight into the mind of Anthony Bourdain as it relates to failures. So for him, in his late life, he says, I always have the right goals, but sometimes I fail at doing what I wanted to do. And that's what he experiences as a failure. However, he prefers that feeling of failure than not trying. Hello, Lauren. Are you back?
They can try and take me out, but I'm going to keep going back. I'm going to keep coming back as long as it takes. I'm very sorry, Jaya.
The deep state is after you. Alright, so
I know.
I was reading quotes of him about suicide, and he was explaining that essentially he did not commit suicide before because he had a view of self-worth. He had a view that going forward in his future, there was still something good he could bring. Now, it appears that what happened 2 days ago was that he didn't have this sense of self-worth. And I don't think that it's irrelevant to this point to know that 3 or 4 months ago, as it is currently reported, we don't have the details, but his family reports that he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Now, Parkinson's disease is a disease with no hope, where you will progressively lose your cognitive capabilities. And so it's clear that Anthony Bourdain was an understanding from 4 months ago that the rest of his life would be less and less pleasurable. And there's often a diagnosis of depression that goes with Parkinson's disease because the areas of the brain that are targeted by Parkinson's disease also happen to affect mood. However, it seems that Anthony Bourdain was cognitively understanding that his condition would get worse and worse and that there would be no cure.
Right, I wonder how much that has to do with it. He was also admittedly a former user of cocaine, heroin, LSD. He had major substance abuse problems when he was younger that he overcame. So he hasn't had an exactly easy ride in the sense that he's had a lot of, health issues, possibly mental health issues. I don't know how much they've gone into that so far. But to be diagnosed with Parkinson's is serious. Like you said, there's no cure. It's almost like being diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Like, it's just going to progressively get worse and worse, and it's not going to get better for you. But he did have an 11-year-old daughter, and he had a younger, sort of like hot girlfriend. So I don't know. I'd have to say I don't think the Parkinson's, maybe it contributed to it, but I don't think it was necessarily the end-all be-all. But again, I guess we don't know what state he was in health-wise. He was still filming his show, though. He was in Paris with a friend. So maybe it's possible there's more going on to the story that we don't know about. But I'm not sure if you wanted to talk about the sort of the prevalence of suicide today and how it's been growing immensely in the past 20 years, specifically among white adult males. They are really suffering under the increases in suicide. In the past 20 years, there was a 30% increase in suicide rates in half of the states in the US. And every single state, except for one, Nevada, the suicide rate has been increasing over the last 20 years. It's becoming an epidemic, and it just keeps climbing in the list of causes of death in the country. And it's funny because people, well, it's not really funny, but people try and talk about the causes when they talk about the rise of suicide, and they say, well, we need more coping skills. We need to be able to cope better. And maybe that means more therapy, maybe that means more drugs, right? Maybe more drugs is the answer to suicide and mental health. Or they say it's community. And another funny instance that they say is that it's firearms. There have been experts, believe it or not, quoted saying that suicide by Americans is a firearm issue because more than half of suicides are done by a gunshot. But it's so ridiculous how, you know, everything becomes a firearm issue and stuff like that. But I think the real problem is not being researched at all. People aren't really looking into so much why people want to kill themselves, because lack of coping skills, so-and-so you can say, but this is something that's changing over time. It's increasing, and within the last 20 years, especially skyrocketing. I think it's something within the culture, or maybe lack of culture is the issue, but it has to be something more than just not enough drugs, because opiate prescriptions are only increasing. And an interesting statistic about opioids is that 90% of the people who have tried opioids in the last 10 years for the first time are white people. So a lot of people don't like to talk about the racial aspect, I guess, but we're not afraid of that here. Opioid addictions and suicide are really a white issue, specifically white males as well. And I believe Anthony Bourdain would be considered a white male suicide statistic, if I'm not incorrect.
For the purpose of these statistics, yes, because they probably wouldn't ask him if he's racially Jewish. Now, yeah, I do want to talk about this. However, I want to point out, in terms of coverage of this whole story of Anthony Bourdain, one guy who really went only to talk about the statistics is Ben Shapiro. And I'm very disappointed journalistically. Ben Shapiro titles his YouTube video, "The Real Reason Why Anthony Bourdain Killed Himself." If you're gonna title this, give me something. Give me a reason in the case of Anthony Bourdain. Instead, Ben Shapiro, like a little robot that he is, starts dropping statistics, and he's like, so this is really an issue, and 93% of the right, blah, 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 blah. He drops this like a catalog of facts dropped over our head. He gives us the hotline phone number for suicide, for suicide prevention, and he does not give any detail that really pertains to the Anthony Bourdain suicide. So that's why I wanted to start with the history of Anthony Bourdain and go through his stuff. I didn't want to do a Ben Shapiro on you guys.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Ben Shapiro is basically just, he spews out statistics all the time in his nasally voice, and he does it so rapid fire, it's really hard to take in. You have to, like, listen to him twice or in slow motion. It's very, very difficult.
And you can see as he drops these statistics, his eye go totally crazy. I thought I could design a Ben Shapiro simulator, and it would just be a twitching Ben Shapiro that drops facts constantly.
Right, and I don't even think it's so much the speed, I think it's the tone of his voice, or the pitch, I guess, that makes it hard to listen to. But yes, it's very technical with him. It's always technical, which with suicide is something that's very, for lack of a better word, romantic kind of death. It's not, a drunk driving statistic. You get drunk and you crash your car. Suicide is driven, from within. It's something really deep and problematic. It's not so much oh, we can point to this thing. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's, and so that's why he's dead now. Or he didn't like Hillary Clinton, and he's dead now. I don't really believe those conspiracies, but you know, you pick out Ben Shapiro for not giving sort of more of an in-depth reason. He advertises it that way. What do you think is the reason that Anthony Bourdain killed himself?
Before we get there, I want to reveal the last fact that I had on my list, and it might give you a clue. 3 days before the suicide of Anthony Bourdain, photographies of his girlfriend were published, holding hand with a reporter called Hugo Clement, and hugging very warmly this reporter who is 26 years old. So a younger man going out with a 40-year-old woman who was herself going out with Anthony Bourdain, who is 61 years old. Anthony Bourdain got cucked by a 26-year-old male in Italy 3 days before his suicide. So that's an important thing to know. Now, what am I saying here? Am I saying that necessarily he got cucked without knowing? Not necessarily. I have two hypotheses here. Either he really didn't know and he really was in love with Asia and it was all good and he felt like she would accompany him in his death with Parkinson's disease. That's kind of the romantic default hypothesis. But a second hypothesis is that Anthony Bourdain realized 4 months ago that he was going to die. And he had enough love for this young female, well, younger than him, to not be a burden to her. And he gave her the permission to flirt other men. He accepted that he would end the rest of his life trying to promote our feminist campaign, trying to give her positions in the CNN crew for his Parts Unknown show, that he would do the best for her, down to accepting being cucked by a younger male, and that he was fine with it. Those are the two hypotheses concerning this event of cuckery. Did you know that, Lauren?
That's more like it, JF. That's really looking into the details there. I didn't know that specific detail, but I did know she had posted online, his girlfriend Asia Argento, a photo of herself with a shirt that said F everybody, and she was like, you know who you are. And after the news came out that he killed himself, she posted this like a day or two before. She had apparently taken it down. So some people were speculating that was aimed towards him, and that perhaps, you know, they were fighting, or there was some, it seems like there was at least some issue, because I didn't know that he was possibly being cucked, and I guess that definitely adds up into the equation. But this guy, again, you know, he has everything, all the material wealth. He really has nothing. He has this 11-year-old daughter. He travels the world, never sees her. He's got ex-wives. He's got this younger girlfriend who's going out with younger guys, cucking him. He's diagnosed with this disease. And where's his home? Where's his family? Where's his stability? And he's still just 61 now, still doing this job, traveling the world and tasting nice food, tasting food that he probably sits there and they make him this 20-course meal and he's just like, whatever, I've seen this before. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's something that would happen very quickly. When you can have anything you wish for, it becomes unimportant. You don't want it anymore when you can just take whatever you want. I'm guessing it was a very unfulfilling lifestyle. I don't believe any of the conspiracies. I think this is a lesson that our culture is sort of being wiped out. We are heading towards just a culture of consumerism. You know, this one world, one people. Anthony Bourdain talked about everybody mixing into some cappuccino race towards consumerism, and that was his life. It was the globalist paradise that everybody wants to push on the world. He got to live it, and he was clearly had internal issues. I'm not going to say that he was empty inside and that was the cause, because I don't know, but I think we can maybe cross material wealth off the list for the meaning of life. Anthony Bourdain, who had it all, just killed himself, and maybe it was because he didn't have a family either. I don't think that's something to exclude. Like last week, Kate Spade killed herself. She was, I think, in her 50s. She was a huge designer. She designed handbags in New York City. She lived on Park Avenue, super rich, sold her company for $2 billion the other year, just a couple years ago. 13-year-old daughter. Very similar case. Her husband and her had just gotten separated within that year. And Anthony Bourdain divorced his wife 2 years ago and left his kid. Very similar cases. They had all the material wealth you could ever ask for, and they were miserable, and they killed themselves. Maybe material wealth is not the end-all be-all or the key to happiness, and I know it might sound cliche, but a lot of people still don't realize that. They're still chasing that lifestyle. They still want to be Anthony Bourdain. And Anthony Bourdain got to say, I'm Anthony Bourdain. And his girlfriend was cucking him. So what's the point? You know, what's the point? Travel the world, sleep with a lot of people, have young girlfriends, boyfriends, you know, hook up with a lot of people, never settle down, live this decadent lifestyle. And what for? You know, we're seeing people, they're examples, and, you know, I'm never happy that someone killed themselves, but they're really sort of proving this idea that this is not what fulfills people. This is not, does not give any meaning to somebody. They're miserable. You wish you could live a day in his lifestyle, and now he's dead. You know, what does that tell you? Maybe it's time to look at these people from the outside. We all think Hollywood and all these people are so glamorous, and most of them have deep internal issues. It's filled with industry, filled with pedophiles, everything they could have in the world, and they're just the worst miserable people. And it's always the people advocating for things like globalism. They advocate for it, and they get a taste for it, and then they cut it off. They cut their whole life off. So, I don't know. I don't want to use anybody's suicide politically, but I think it kind of goes without saying that they're proving these lifestyles to be fruitless, that there's no point, and that we need to search for an alternative, and that a culture of consumerism, a cappuccino world where all the diverse cultures mix into one and we get to experience it all at once, is not something that's going to improve our lives at all.
Beautiful conclusion. I'll also do mine because I don't want people to take my last comment on the cucking by the girlfriend and think that JF's theory is that Anthony Bourdain killed himself because his girlfriend left him. I think it's way more complex, and I think you put your fingers on very important aspects of this. So my view is just like you. He is a Jewish person who has no identity as part of any group, not even the Jews to a certain extent.
Your mic is fuzzy.
Oh, shit.
Anthony Bourdain is a man without roots.
This is something I need to correct. Is that better now?
Yep, you're good.
Alright, it's my new demand on the CPU of my computer. I need to get a totally new CPU. I'll get some huge upgrade. I will get some 10-core Intel Xeon Super Tower server. And it will never become robotic. Alright, so as far as Anthony Bourdain goes, he had no identity. The dream world, as you described it, his dream world was one of globalism, and he lived the full life of globalism in all of its aspects, having friends in all countries, friends that he could connect with. These connections were leading him to have success in his business. This guy is the incarnation of the Jewish lifestyle with no root to any country, always on the run, always hating every place that he goes to. Even in cooking, from the very beginning, Anthony Bourdain was good at cooking, or was good at understanding food, because of the food he hated. He was discarding stuff for not being good. He was hating the sides. He was hating every piece until it was good. And even when it was good, he says that one of the greatest drama he experienced as a cook was to find out that he could master great cooking, but that his customers would request burgers from him, would request to always go back to stuff that he didn't think were the best. In other words, he even ended up hating his customers because they were not ordering his best meals. They were keeping him down. So this is a life of hatred. He then shared his own hate against white people, against white society, against any form of authority. And this hate was spreading to any system of authority, including left-wing, right-wing, any form of authority he was contesting. So he lived a life in constant fleeing of any sort of system in which he could fit. He was an anarchist. And even his own family, he wouldn't let them put obligations on his life that would take too much time. He spent less than half the year with his daughter. Even that time was not full time with his daughter because it was shared with his ex-wife. He could not stick to a family. He could not stick to a woman. He could not even stick to his daughter. And when you are in that state, and all you have is your current cute girlfriend who's an Italian model, and she happens to be a third-wave feminist, that's the thing that he did not hate at first. He got engaged on the route of third-wave feminism. He retweeted so many times about the campaign of his girlfriend Asia. He was totally into third-wave feminism, and he said many times in interviews, he wanted to unlock the mystery of why there were so few women coming to him when he was filming stuff in other countries. And he didn't see this as a mystery on the part of the woman. He was asking himself, why am I looking aggressive to these women? Why don't they open to me? What am I doing wrong so that they don't come, and that we end up having parts unknown being like 90% males, showing us the culinary talents of their country. And so that was the last mission of Anthony Bourdain. He had the mission of understanding women to a point where he got carried into third-wave feminism by his girlfriend Asia. He thought, what if I abandon all of my thinking? What if I abandon all of my critical view on this and I just adopt their belief and understand their beliefs? Just as feminists, by the way, ask us to do. They say, don't deny my subjective experience. They say, if I share an allegation about a man, consider it to be true. He dived fully into the third-wave feminist lifestyle. And 5 days ago, he realized not only that he was about to die of Parkinson, that the rest of his life would be at best meaningless if he was healthy, and at worst that he would end up being a burden to the people he should have cared in his life, like his daughter. But that Asia herself was dissociating herself from him, and that she was willing to hold hands and hug another man in Italy while he was in France, suffering and knowing that the rest of his life would be useless. And he's decided to put an end to it because he thought that living that part of his life was less worth it than not living it, and that what was to come was too negative, having been betrayed by the woman that he abandoned his own rethinking to by following her blindly on her quest of third-wave feminism, and he chose to die.
I think you put your finger right on it. He, like most people who commit suicide, see no future, and you don't get there from living a fulfilling life. He never settled down and set down his roots. He lived the lifestyle that is constantly sold to us by the media and Hollywood, always on the TV. What you should do is travel the world, enjoy cultures. You want to be rich, you want to have the newest thing. You know, everybody has cell phones, and everybody has cars. We're the richest people in the world, but the suicide rate continues to climb, even though we have everything you could possibly want in another country. I think the lesson here, and the thing to never forget about Anthony Bourdain, is that he lived the lifestyle that is always sold to you. He lived it. He's the example. The rootless, consumerist, global lifestyle is exactly what Anthony Bourdain had, and he destroyed his soul. and he killed himself. So what does that tell you?
I fully agree with your diagnosis. Let's see the super chats and then we can move to a general discussion on some of the statistics you've raised and my view on it. Matthew Brown said, when will you have Striker on, says Glenn K. Eric Striker, I want him on, but he doesn't have Twitter, so I have to Gab him, and then Gab deletes messages after 24 hours. What the fuck is that, Gab? Get it together. Matthew Robinson says, sending shekels to second getting Striker. None of your business, says, hi Jeff, will you ever do an episode in French? I would love to, but at the same time, you have no idea the amount of people who will be pissed if I do that. They're like, they want their English JF, and suddenly I'm gonna show up here and do a French show. I'm gonna wait for the right moment, and I'll do it. Eternal Mathematics says, the irony with this show is that it could be interpreted as showing the value in nationalism. Exploring all these unique cultures should emphasize the value in preserving them. I fully agree, and that's how I was looking at Parts Unknown. But the problem with Anthony Bourdain is that he didn't have the intellectual insight into what led to the beauty that he was able to observe. Or posterity says, did he mean the world mixing or only Europe? And what did he mean get out of this? Out of what? Hate and tribalism will end if everyone is mixed? Yeah, so the greater context of the conversations we quoted was hate. So he wanted a solution against hate. And his solution was that if everyone mixes and we all become cappuccino colored, as the guest termed it, there would be no more hate. Secret Genius says, a pair of scientists who wanted to study the opium epidemic as it affects white, specifically were shut down. Accusations of, you guessed it, racism. Frederick White says, white men are killing themselves because they have no women or kids. I blame feminism. And maybe not a bad diagnosis, it could be part of it. Pinky Culture says, Lauren, depression is usually linked to unhealthy lifestyle. America has high rate of suicide. I think we can all put 2 and 2 together. Peter Bakarev says, good job guys. Only thing I liked about that guy, that he stood up for Palestine. Other than that, he was godless motherfucker. Zyklon B. Peterson says, it was actually Fugu, I tell you, Fugu. Hashtag danger zone. This is a cover-up, deflection by the big puffer fish industry to prevent drop in sales. I think he's trolling. And Booger B says, studies suggest as many as 70 to 80% of those with Parkinson's experience sexual dysfunction. Fact. Alright, I thank you all for the super chat. Now on your earlier point, Lauren, about what leads to the current suicide epidemic. I think it's probably a combination of factors. When you think about it, what is it correlated to? Well, it's correlated to, one, there's less religion. There's secularism has invaded our society. Two, the young people, although they live in an economic system that seems like it has good numbers, like you look at our GDP, we're rich, and a lot of people say, oh, there's no correlation between our country's GDP and suicide because poor countries don't commit suicide. And they're right. It's not material well-being that influences suicide. However, the young people who grow in our society, they don't benefit much from this material well-being. Most of them will end up being enslaved in the system at minimal salary, and so their optics on the future is not that great, even if the material well-being is there. And yes, we have water, we have good stuff, we live in houses, that's beautiful. Even a minimum salary person can rent an apartment and somehow be covered from the rain. So material well-being is there at a sort of ceiling, but hope for the future is not that high in young people because they see the economic system deploy in front of them and they see that they have no hope of escalating the ladders like their parents did because the economy doesn't seem like it's going to grow infinitely. So on that I say maybe economic factors. Another factor is the availability of radical measures to kill yourself. So guns, I don't say guns are a cause of suicide, but I point out to the fact that 100 years ago, access to gun was much less than it is today. Access to, in fact, many means, such as bridges, such as public transportation, which people use to commit suicide, all of these things didn't exist 100 years ago. So if you want to diagnose why, part of it will be to say that the means of suicide are more numerous in our society. A fourth factor that I will name is access to information. We live in a digital world where the suicide of a celebrity gets communicated much faster. In the ancient world, 100 years ago, for a suicide to be reported in the newspaper, there was already a threshold that was hard to reach, and then for the newspaper to get to a lot of people, there was, again, lots of slow information transfer. Today, we have these cases covered across the media, and it gives people ideas. It awakes the possibility, and someone who would otherwise have had just a little depression, is now has access to information in the public space that leads them to understand means by which they could commit suicide. So that's another factor, the amount of information that we expose people to.
Right. One thing that I thought was interesting when I was looking into the suicide rates in the country is that it's mostly escalating, at least in the United States, which is what I was looking at, in the rural areas, and specifically white males in the rural areas of the country. In cities, urban areas, non-Hispanic whites are the most likely to kill themselves. And then if you go to the rural areas, it's actually the Native Americans. They have extremely high substance abuse rates and suicide rates, the Native Americans. And a lot of people attribute that, the Native Americans' case of substance abuse and suicide, to a loss of culture, their nation, their land. They've been, it's been hijacked by previously Europeans and now just Americans in general, and they're pushed off onto these reservations, and they're denied their land, things like that. And people say this is why the Native Americans are now so addicted to substances and are killing themselves. And I started to wonder if there's a link between that and what's happening to whites now. The effects of immigration have only started to kick in the last couple of decades. And this whole global culture, which was really accelerated by the internet, we are now so connected. And whites are considered the default. They have no culture, right? And they're the worst. They're demons. They're the devils. Everybody else, diversity means everybody except whites, which is interesting because Anthony Bourdain once banned whites from one of his events in Houston because he said he wanted a show based on diversity. So he banned whites.
They're not even part of the diversity.
Right. Diversity means, everybody's included, all the different people, but diversity really means non-whites, excluding whites. Right. So whites, within their own homes, allow this to happen, allow all this dialogue about whites not being included in diversity, having no culture, having terrible, imperialistic, evil, murderous history, like that's unique to just white people, right?
Absolutely. I think that your hypothesis makes sense. It could be a form of bullying. The anti-white bullying is so present. Sorry, we lost you for a while. The anti-white bullying is so present in society that maybe young white people feel guilty, and they actually feel it, that it is their fault, or they feel that the people around them are hostile to me.
Right, and I was just thinking, I sort of like a light bulb went off in my head as I was driving home today, that it's almost like whites are now being conquered, just like the Native Americans once were. And now if you look at the Native Americans...
Oh, we're losing you again. Yeah, so we're losing you by
Can't hear me?
Yeah, now you're back. Hello? You're back, but I can't hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Okay, yeah, now you're back.
Okay, I'm not sure if you missed anything, so I'll just repeat myself.
Yeah.
It's very comparable to, in my mind, the Native Americans who were conquered on their land, and it's almost the same thing happening now with immigration and whites. We know whites are becoming a minority, and everybody in power is saying they have no culture, and the world will be better off without them. We need to breed them out of existence. And that sort of rhetoric is sort of even more harsh. We would never say that about Native Americans. And whites are like the Native Americans, but in a different way. They're not being pushed off their land because of war and battles. They're being pushed off, it's white flight. The cities and the spread of immigrants and minorities into the suburbs, and whites continuously flee, and now they're like leaving California to go to Texas and Colorado, and whites are moving out of the cities to go have families, and they're really being pushed out of a lot of areas of this country. And it's very reminiscent of the plight of the Native Americans, in my mind, who are now in a absolutely terrible state of using substances and killing themselves. Maybe it's not totally connected, but I think it's important to note that whites really are sort of being pushed out of their own country, and the mainstream rhetoric is that this is a good thing. Everybody's against them. And I think the loss of culture as well is something to not forget. We're moving towards this consumerist culture where all white people know is other cultures and just buying things and gaining material wealth and getting as rich as possible, and don't have a family, that's boring, that holds you down. Be an independent woman, or if you're a man, be a bachelor, and you can go on Tinder and have lots of women and sleep with them, and why would you ever want to have a family or children? And it's just an empty lifestyle that's being promoted to whites, and they latch onto it because the mainstream tells them that this is good for them. And I think it's just people have no more roots. And I think the whole rooted versus rootless is a really simple way to put it, and it works because Anthony Bourdain as well was a totally rootless cosmopolitan, and now he's in the ground, or will be very soon. And the globalist lifestyle is pushing, the United States is like the symbol of globalism at this point. And it's promoting everybody to just spread and cut off the roots, forget having families, forget having any meaning or purpose. White people are the worst. They need to be bred out of existence. And the world's against them. So I can't say that that's a main cause, but I think it's definitely a contributing factor, as well as in general the loss of community, which, like you said, relates back to the church. People feel alone, which is a big problem when it comes to suicide and mental illness. They don't have a family support group, which came with church and community. It's just the atomized culture of the West that I think is the biggest problem relating to mental illness. And instead of saying maybe we need to rebuild communities, maybe it's time to bring the church back, or other alternatives, we say we need more drugs. We need more drugs, and we need to pump you all with prescriptions, and that's going to make you happy. And they're selling not solutions, but accelerants and more problems. And I'm not quite sure how we're supposed to fix it at this point.
I fully agree with your diagnosis. I will say, as far as the parallel between whites and Native Americans, in terms of displacement, that may be a factor, yes. I would also add a more general parallel. The genes of Native Americans have evolved to handle tribal lifestyle where they would hunt and survive on their own in nature. So the reason that they are faced with a world right now that's developing around them that their genes have not evolved to handle. And I would say the same of whites. They've not evolved to handle such a feministizing and such a left-wing society where there's authority that tells them how to think and what they shouldn't say. That's not how males have evolved to be. Males have evolved to be together when they are together and they're not with their family, to be fully free to say any joke, to be breaking taboos. But in our society, we catch these taboos and we make international headlines with them, and so people feel in a big prison where, okay, I'm going to be used between my 18 years old and my 60 years old. I'm going to be used for 50 years approximately by a system that will pay something like the minimal salary. There's no hope for me to escalate the system because there's too much people, and on top of it, I cannot even have a social life because there's so much things that are taboo at this point that each of these social relations I engage in, I have to be careful not to break this taboo, or not to suggest this, or not to talk about race, or not to assume the gender of someone. So this police society is not what we've evolved for, and we need to bring society back to a sensical structure. Lauren, I think it was awesome. I thank you for being here. We will have a look at the technology and see if we can.
Oh, look at all the millennials in your chat. Smoking's bad for you, Jim. No shit.
That's why he does it.
There's a lot of shit that's bad for you.
True.
Somebody said Newports. Get the fuck out of here.
Newport menthol.
I actually used to smoke Newports.
Oh, why?
I don't know why. Just because everybody around me smoked Newports when I was like younger. So.
God, did you grow up in Boston? Like what?
I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. So yeah, a lot of melanated individuals around that area, and even the white people, a lot of them smoke.
Oh yeah. People always give you always hear the shit about stereotypes aren't real. No, dude, black people smoke Newports. That's fucking 100% legit. There's no
Newports and then Cools.
Yeah.
Cools are even nastier than Newports though. So yeah, don't smoke Cools. Pimp sticks, that's what they used to call them. Pimp sticks. Holy shit, Newports. Ugh. And then there was always this urban legend. I mean, I don't know if it's urban legend or not, but apparently the Newports had fiberglass in them, and they would, like, crystallize your lungs or some shit. I'm pretty sure it's some shit somebody made up, but...
Well, they're like menthol cigarettes are fucking... they would give me a headache. It was like I was smoking chewing gum. Like, I never understood the fucking appeal of menthol cigarettes.
I always hated them, but I just kind of got... Like everybody else is smoking.
Oh, I know your type. You're the asshole that would bum cigarettes off people, right?
Yeah.
That's why you smoke Newports. Yeah, I know your type. I'm good with whatever, guy. That's fine. I'll smoke whatever. I don't care.
Hey, now I'm cool, Jim. I vape now, so, you know.
Oh, fuck. I hope it explodes in your face. Fuck.
What? You can't hate on this. My shit tastes like Fruity Pebbles. That's literally the name of my flavor.
I hate these fuckers walking around with their vape pens, and it's like the center of their life, and they fucking vape everywhere, and they blow out fucking clouds everywhere. And
it's like, I'm not smoking. I can vape anywhere. Walk through Walgreens and shit, blowing smoke. Or vape, excuse me.
Just vaping, yeah, until their lithium battery fucking goes nuclear on them and burns their hands off. Yeah.
Blows the side of their face off, yeah. Oh, luckily that hasn't happened.
You know, it only happens with like the really, really cheap, shitty ones, because they're made in China and the batteries are no good.
Yeah, this is actually almost all of them's made in China. So
yeah.
My vape, I won't show it because it's too. I guess I could send you the link. It's kind of comical what my.
Don't link me to your vape pen thing.
No, it's not a pen with the mods. It's like a big mod box.
Wait, you have a giant vape box?
Yeah, it's pretty big.
The size of a fucking book you're walking down the street?
It's pretty fucking huge, I'm not gonna lie.
Oh no.
Look at it. Google this, Zidane. My Wi-Fi here sucks. Google G-Priv 2 Lux Edition.
See, when you say it's gigantic, I just imagine you walking up with like a giant-ass boom box with one of those like fucking opium fucking pipes sticking out of it. That's what I mean.
Like gold. It's crazy. Like it's goofy as fuck.
Is this it? Similar.
Let me see. Wait, where are you?
Yeah, it's gonna take a second for it to come up.
Oh god, it's
that's it. That's it. Except mine's gold instead of the rainbow. It's like all gold. So yeah, it's like all like golden trim and shit. That's actually it, though, man.
Is it big enough for you?
It's pretty.
It looks like somebody took a pack of cigarettes and then took a car lighter and glued them together, and that's what you're fucking smoking from.
Yeah. You know, you're probably not far from that. Chat's calling you a wigger now.
How does that make me more of a wigger than smoking Newports? Come on.
I think the Newports.
I don't even know.
Okay, the Newports. Yeah. Nog vape. I used the pin con when I was smoking THC. I've never used the pin con. Actually, that's a lie. I did try it with the nicotine ones, but they're so harsh that I couldn't do it.